A karate champion punched a royal guard in the chest, convinced his skills made him unstoppable. But one move from the guard changed everything, leaving the so-called champion gasping for air and the crowd in stunned silence. Here's what happened. Now, before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel because tomorrow at the same time, we'll bring you another story of courage and discipline from the Royal Guards that you won't want to miss. The crowd outside Windsor Castle parted instinctively as Eric Matthews strode through the main courtyard, his championship belt slung over one shoulder and gleaming in the midday sun. Windsor Castle's ancient stone walls rose majestically against the clear blue sky, the royal standard fluttering gently above the round tower, signalling the Queen was in residence. Tourists from across the globe captured photos of the historic fortress, its grandeur a testament to nearly 1,000 years of British monarchy. But all eyes now turned to Eric as he walked with the swagger of someone accustomed to attention. His entourage of 4 training partners followed in his wake, their matching tracksuits displaying the Matthews Combat Academy logo prominently across their backs. Each man carried himself with the confident bearing of career fighters, their physicality evident even in casual movement. The smallest of them would have been imposing alone. As a group, they commanded immediate notice. "Is this what passes for security in England?" Eric announced loudly, gesturing toward guard Thomas Collins, who stood motionless at his post, standing still like a mannequin. "That's not real combat readiness." At 35, Eric had built his reputation through 15 years of competitive karate, with 7 national championships and 3 international titles to his name. His fighting style had been profiled in martial arts magazines worldwide, many declaring him the most technically precise competitor of his generation. Sponsors had flocked to him, his signature line of training equipment grossing millions annually. His California dojo had expanded to 5 locations across the West Coast, each promising to teach real-world combat effectiveness rather than outdated traditions. Celebrities and professional athletes paid premium fees for private sessions, all hoping to learn the techniques that had made him virtually undefeated in tournament competition. The gold medal hanging from a ribbon around his neck caught the light as he walked, a physical reminder of his most recent tournament victory in Berlin, where he had defeated the reigning European champion in under 2 minutes. "Look at this stance," Eric continued, circling guard Collins with the predatory assessment of a career fighter. "Completely exposed. Center of gravity all wrong. Any decent martial artist could take him down in seconds." Several tourists stepped back, sensing the tension in Eric's movements. A family from Japan quietly ushered their children away, the parents exchanging glances of disapproval. Eric seemed not to notice, or perhaps not to care, as he continued his assessment. "Hey Mike, get this on camera," Eric called to one of his entourage. "Educational content for the students back home. How not to stand if you actually want to defend yourself." Guard Collins remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed forward in disciplined focus. His scarlet tunic and bearskin cap stood in stark contrast to Eric's modern athletic wear. Behind his ceremonial stillness lay 8 years of military service, including 2 tours in Afghanistan and specialized training that the tourists photographing him knew nothing about. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eric addressed the growing crowd with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to demonstration classes, "what you're looking at is military theatre, not military effectiveness. These guards are trained to look impressive, not to actually fight." His voice carried across the courtyard, drawing more attention with each word. "In my dojo, the first thing we teach is that stillness equals vulnerability. A fighter who doesn't move might as well wear a target." The crowd's reactions were mixed. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious. A few American tourists nodded in agreement. But all eyes were now fixed on the developing scene as Eric positioned himself directly in front of guard Collins, close enough that the guard could likely feel his breath. Let's see what real fighting stance looks like, Eric announced, dropping into a perfect karate position, his body coiled with potential energy. This is how actual combat professionals stand, ready for anything, not just standing pretty for photos. The fundamental problem with military stances, Eric projected his voice like a seminar instructor, is that they prioritize appearance over function. He demonstrated a series of balanced positions, each movement precise and fluid, the result of thousands of hours of training. Look at this guard's positioning, he continued, gesturing dismissively toward Collins. Feet together, hands occupied, weight distributed for appearance rather than stability. Eric circled the guard again, analyzing his posture with professional scrutiny. In any legitimate combat situation, this stance would get you killed in seconds. His entourage had formed a semicircle behind him, creating an impromptu stage that separated Collins from the rest of the crowd. The tallest of Eric's training partners, a heavyweight fighter named Jason, began filming with a professional camera while the others positioned themselves strategically. Every championship fighter knows that your stance is your foundation, Eric continued, performing a textbook perfect front kick that stopped just inches from the guard's torso. Without proper foundation, all your training means nothing. A palace staff member in a dark suit approached cautiously, his expression carefully neutral. Sir, I must ask you to maintain an appropriate distance from the Queen's Guard. Eric turned with exaggerated surprise. I'm conducting an educational demonstration, comparing effective combat techniques to outdated military posturing. He flashed his championship medal. Eric Matthews, 3-time international champion. I'm qualified to assess combat effectiveness. Nevertheless, sir, the staff member insisted, there are regulations regarding interaction with the guards. Fine, fine, Eric raised his hands in mock surrender. I'll stay back, but my assessment stands. He addressed the crowd again. What they don't tell you in these tourist brochures is that this ceremonial stuff has nothing to do with actual fighting capability. It's tradition, not training. Among the onlookers, an older man in a tweed jacket watched with growing concern. Martin Bedford had served 30 years with the Royal Marines before retiring as a lieutenant colonel, and he recognised the dangerous path this demonstration was taking. His weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes tracked every movement with military precision. You know what we call this stance in competitive martial arts? Eric continued, ignoring the staff member's warning. We call it the beginner's mistake. Standing flat-footed, weight-centred, arms occupied with equipment rather than ready to defend. He demonstrated a defensive position, hands raised in textbook form. This is proper combat readiness. Two of Eric's entourage nodded enthusiastically. Show them the competition stance, Eric, one called out. These guards, Eric continued, energy building in his voice, are trained to prioritize appearance over effectiveness. They're historical artifacts, not combat specialists. The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the spectacle. A group of British teenagers exchanged uncomfortable glances, while several American tourists whispered excitedly, phones raised to capture the confrontation. The staff member had stepped back, speaking urgently into a radio clipped to his lapel. Eric's voice rose further, taking on the quality of a ringside announcer. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing is the fundamental difference between ceremonial tradition and actual combat training. One prepares you for pictures, the other prepares you for survival. Eric shifted into a series of combat stances, each movement flowing into the next with championship precision. Notice the difference in weight distribution, he announced, demonstrating a perfect front stance. In my position, I can attack or defend in any direction. In his, he gestured toward Collins, he can stand still and look pretty. The guard remained motionless, his eyes fixed forward, his discipline unwavering despite the growing spectacle around him. The summer sun glinted off his brass buttons as Eric continued his impromptu seminar. The problem with military training, Eric said, executing a flawless roundhouse kick that stopped inches from Collins's position, is that it's designed for group tactics, not individual combat excellence. In the martial arts world, we focus on maximizing each fighter's potential. He performed another sequence of moves, each one demonstrating undeniable skill. His body moved with the fluid precision that had made him a champion, every technique executed with textbook perfection. Watch how a real martial artist generates power, Eric instructed, launching a lightning-fast punch that whistled past Collins's ear. It's all about proper body mechanics, not about standing at attention. Lieutenant Colonel Bedford had seen enough. He stepped forward, his military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. "Young man," he addressed Eric with quiet authority, "I suggest you reconsider your demonstration. The Queen's Guard are not what you seem to think they are." Eric sized up the older man with a practiced eye. "With all due respect, sir," he said with a smile that contradicted his words, "there's a reason why championship fighters train with me and not with the British Army. Different leagues entirely." "That's not my point," Bedford replied evenly. "These guards are trained to stand still," Eric cut him off. "I understand the historical significance, but from a combat perspective, it's outdated. They're trained to march, I'm trained to fight. Big difference." He turned back to the crowd, dismissing Bedford's intervention. "Let me show you something about real defensive positioning." He moved even closer to Collins, performing a series of blocks and counters that showcased his technical expertise. Every movement has purpose, nothing wasted, nothing for show. A young woman with children pulled them away from the scene, murmuring, "This is disrespectful, we're leaving." Several others followed their example, uncomfortable with the escalating tension. The palace staff member returned, accompanied now by a security officer. "Sir, this is your final warning. You must maintain distance from the guard." "I'm almost finished with my demonstration," Eric replied, his tone hardening slightly. "The people here are learning something valuable about the difference between ceremony and actual combat readiness." He turned back to Collins, whose expression remained perfectly controlled despite the provocation. "No disrespect to the uniform," Eric said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But this is exactly why military training doesn't translate to real fighting ability. Too much emphasis on looking good, not enough on being effective." His entourage had tightened their circle, creating a more defined performance space. Jason continued filming, zooming in on Eric's techniques as he moved through another series of demonstrations. "In any competitive fighting environment," Eric projected his voice to reach the entire courtyard, "the first rule is simple. Movement equals survival. Stillness equals defeat." "Let's take this demonstration to the next level," Eric announced, his voice carrying across the now silent courtyard. "I've shown you the theoretical problems with ceremonial stances. Now I'll demonstrate the practical implications." He adjusted his position, centering himself in front of Collins with practiced precision. The guard remained motionless, though there was a subtle change in the air around him, like the gathering pressure before a storm. Bedford took a step forward, recognizing the danger signs in Eric's posture. "This has gone far enough," Bedford called out, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command. "Actually," Eric replied, "we're just getting to the educational part." He addressed the crowd again, assuming the role of instructor. "In combat sports and real-world self-defense, one of the first principles we test is structural integrity. A proper stance maintains integrity under pressure. A flawed stance collapses." Eric began a methodical sequence of stretches, preparing with the routine of a professional fighter. His movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, the physical preparation for combat that had become second nature through years of competition. "What I'm about to demonstrate," he continued, "is why static positioning fails against dynamic force application. In competition, we call this pressure testing a technique. The palace security officer moved forward with renewed urgency. "Sir, you need to step back now." Eric ignored him, focused entirely on his demonstration. His eyes locked onto Collins's chest, calculating angles and force requirements with the automatic precision that came from thousands of competitive matches. "The human body has natural weak points," Eric lectured, rolling his shoulders to loosen them. "Proper martial arts training teaches you to protect those points while exploiting your opponent's vulnerabilities." "Don't do it!" someone from the crowd shouted. "You're making a mistake!" For a fraction of a second, doubt flickered across Eric's face. Then his championship confidence reasserted itself. "This is controlled demonstration," he called back. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Bedford's voice cut through the tension. "Guard Collins is not what you think he is. He's not just ceremonial." "That's exactly my point," Eric interrupted. "These guards are presented as elite soldiers, but they're trained for ceremony, not combat." He settled into his stance, weight perfectly distributed, hands positioned with championship precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to see is the difference between appearance and reality." Eric launched forward with explosive speed, his movement displaying the fluid grace that had made him a champion. The technique was flawless, a straight punch delivered with perfect body alignment, directed precisely at Collins's sternum. It was the same punch that had won him his second international title, executed with the confidence of someone who had never doubted its effectiveness. The impact was audible, a sharp thud that silenced the gasps from the crowd. Eric's fist connected solidly with Collins's chest, the force travelling through the scarlet tunic and into the guard's body. For one frozen moment, nothing happened. Collins remained motionless, the only sign of impact a slight swaying of his bearskin cap. A thin trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth, evidence that the blow had connected with significant force. Eric stepped back, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. "You see?" he announced to the stunned audience. "That's exactly what I was talking about. No defensive reaction, no counter, no—" The words died in his throat as Collins's eyes shifted for the first time, moving from their forward focus to lock directly onto Eric's face. There was nothing ceremonial in that gaze, only the cold, focused calculation of a predator who had just been given permission to respond. The change in Collins was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment he stood in ceremonial stillness. The next, he moved with a precision that made Eric's championship techniques look like amateur flailing. Collins's ceremonial rifle clattered to the stones as his right hand shot forward in a perfect strike that connected with devastating accuracy to Eric's solar plexus. The blow wasn't showy or dramatic. Just a textbook perfect combat technique delivered with the force of someone who had applied such moves in life or death situations. His strike found the nerve cluster with surgical precision, the kind of targeting that comes not from tournament practice, but from specialized close-quarters combat training developed specifically for special operations units. The technique itself was deceptively simple, a straight strike with slightly curled fingers. The impact distributed across precisely the right area to trigger a vasovagal response, while simultaneously disrupting the diaphragm's contraction pattern. It was the exact kind of technique deliberately excluded from sporting competitions due to its incapacitating effects. A move designed not to score points, but to immediately neutralize threats in combat scenarios where hesitation meant death. The effect was immediate. Eric's lungs emptied in a violent exhale, his diaphragm spasming from the precisely placed impact. His eyes widened in shock as he desperately tried to draw breath, finding himself suddenly, terrifyingly unable to do so. The colour drained from his face as he staggered backward, his body bent forward at the waist, hands clutching desperately at his chest as his nervous system tried to process what had just happened. Collins didn't hesitate or pause to admire his work. With the same fluid economy of movement, he stepped forward and executed a perfect sweep that took Eric's legs from under him. The champion crashed to the stones, still fighting for breath, his championship medal skittering across the courtyard with a metallic sound that seemed to punctuate his fall from confidence to humiliation. "Stay down," Collins spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the quiet authority of command rather than the anger of someone who'd been assaulted. "Breathe slowly." Eric couldn't have disobeyed if he wanted to. The clinical precision of Collins's strike had targeted exactly the right pressure point to temporarily paralyze his breathing without causing permanent damage. He lay on the stones, one hand clutching his chest, his face contorted as he struggled for air, the other hand raised in a gesture that might have been surrender if he'd had enough breath to articulate it. Collins maintained a perfect stance above him. Not the ceremonial position from before, but the balanced readiness of a combat veteran ready to respond to any further threat. There was nothing showy in his posture, nothing designed to impress onlookers. This was pure functional efficiency, the kind that comes not from dojos and tournaments, but from environments where mistakes cost lives rather than points. Jason had dropped his camera, the expensive equipment forgotten as he stared in shock. The rest of Eric's entourage had backed away, their earlier confidence evaporated. One of them took a hesitant step forward, but Collins's gaze shifted to him with such focused intensity that he immediately retreated, hands raised in clear submission. "The difference between us," Collins said, his voice pitched to carry to Eric but not much further, "is that I was trained to end threats, not win points." Eric's breathing had started to return, coming in ragged gasps as his diaphragm slowly recovered from the precision strike. He tried to speak, but could only produce a wheezing cough that echoed painfully across the suddenly silent courtyard. "You're experiencing diaphragm paralysis," Collins explained with clinical detachment. "Temporary. 30 seconds and you'll breathe normally again." Bedford had moved forward to stand beside Collins, his military bearing matching the guards. "That," he addressed the stunned crowd, "is the difference between ceremony and capability. These guards aren't just trained to stand still. They're trained to eliminate threats with maximum efficiency and minimum force." Eric had managed to push himself up to one elbow, his breathing still laboured but improving. His eyes, which had shown such confidence before, now held the humbled recognition of someone who'd severely miscalculated. The championship arrogance had vanished completely, replaced by a mixture of pain, shock, and dawning respect. "How?" he gasped. "How did you—" "Special reconnaissance," Collins replied simply. "We don't train for tournaments, we train for survival." One of Eric's entourage had recovered enough confidence to approach again. "Hey man, he was just demonstrating." "He was assaulting a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces while on duty," Bedford cut in sharply. "A serious criminal offence." Eric had regained enough breath to speak in short sentences. "That technique. Never seen it." "Competition." "Because it's not designed for competition," Collins replied, maintaining his balanced stance. "It's designed to neutralize threats quickly and effectively." He studied Eric with the assessment of a professional. "Your technique was actually quite good, perfect for scoring points under controlled conditions, but you're operating under a fundamental misconception." His voice remained calm, instructional rather than angry. "We're not ceremonial figures with basic training. We're combat soldiers, temporarily assigned to ceremonial duty." Eric struggled to a sitting position, wincing as his diaphragm continued to spasm. "You moved so fast." "Ceremonial duty doesn't change what we are," Collins replied. "It just adds additional protocols regarding when and how we respond." Palace security personnel surrounded the scene, their approach professional and controlled. The lead officer nodded respectfully to Collins. "Situation contained, guardsman?" "Affirmative," Collins replied, stepping back to allow security to take control. He retrieved his ceremonial rifle, resuming a position of parade rest, rather than returning immediately to ceremonial stance. The small trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth was the only visible evidence of Eric's strike. The security team helped Eric to his feet, his breathing now more regular, though he remained hunched from the lingering pain. His championship confidence had vanished, replaced by the shocked expression of someone whose world had just been fundamentally recalibrated. Bedford addressed the gathered tourists, his voice carrying the measured authority of a senior officer. I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding here, which has unfortunately led to a criminal assault. He gestured toward Collins, who stood at parade rest, his bearing professional despite the interruption to his duties. Guard Collins, like all members of the Queen's Guard, is an active duty soldier temporarily assigned to ceremonial duty. Before wearing this uniform, he served with the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, one of Britain's most elite Special Forces units. A murmur of interest passed through the crowd. Several tourists glanced between Eric and Collins with new understanding. The contrast between sport martial arts and military combat training now starkly illustrated. 2 tours in Afghanistan, Bedford continued, plus deployments to locations that remain classified. The ceremonial stillness these guards maintain is not an indication of limited capability, but rather a demonstration of the exceptional discipline that characterizes elite military units. Eric, now flanked by security personnel, seemed to be absorbing these truths with painful clarity. I didn't know, he said, his voice lacking its earlier projection. I thought they were just ceremonial. That's a common misconception, Bedford acknowledged. The Queen's Guard are drawn from 5 active infantry regiments, rotating between operational deployments and ceremonial duties. The Guard who stands ceremonial watch today might have been conducting counter-terrorism operations 6 months ago. Eric looked directly at Collins, professional respect replacing his earlier contempt. That strike to the solar plexus. I've never seen anything disable someone so effectively. Different training for different purposes, Collins replied evenly. Your techniques are optimized for scoring points under specific rules. Mine are optimized for neutralizing threats. Different objectives require different approaches. A security officer stepped forward. Sir, we need to process you for formal charges. Assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard is a serious offence. Eric nodded, accepting this with surprising composure. I understand. He turned to Collins once more. For what it's worth, I apologize. I completely misjudged what I was looking at. A common error, Collins replied without emotion. Most people see the ceremonial uniform and miss the soldier wearing it. As security prepared to escort Eric away, Bedford addressed the crowd once more. The discipline you witness in these guards, the ability to stand motionless for hours, to maintain perfect composure regardless of provocation. That's not separate from their combat training. It's an integral part of it. The same mental control that allows a soldier to remain still under tourist harassment is what allows them to remain calm under enemy fire. Police officers arrived with professional efficiency, taking statements from witnesses, while Eric sat on a bench, looking considerably humbled. His entourage stood awkwardly nearby, no longer the confident team that had arrived earlier. Assault on a serving member of Her Majesty's forces, the lead officer explained, reviewing the charges. It's treated with particular severity when the guard is on ceremonial duty. Eric nodded, accepting his situation with surprising dignity. I understand. I made a serious error in judgment. Bedford had taken a position near Collins, the 2 military men exchanging the subtle nods of mutual recognition that transcend rank and era of service. As the police completed their paperwork, Bedford addressed the remaining tourists who had gathered at a respectful distance. What many visitors don't realise about the Queen's Guard is that their ceremonial role is secondary to their military function. These guards are selected based on exemplary service records, not on how well they can stand still. He gestured toward Collins, who had returned to his ceremonial position, his bearing perfect, despite the interruption. Before Guard Collins was assigned to Windsor Castle, he served multiple combat deployments with special reconnaissance units. The skills you just witnessed were developed in environments where failure meant more than lost points in a tournament. A young American tourist raised his hand tentatively. But why don't they tell us this in the guidebooks? Why let people think they're just ceremonial? Bedford smiled slightly. There's operational security to consider, but more importantly, perhaps, is the British tradition of understatement. We don't feel the need to announce our capabilities. We simply maintain them. As Eric was escorted toward a police vehicle, he paused near Collins, who remained at his post, eyes forward in perfect ceremonial form. "Your diaphragm control technique," Eric said quietly. "That's not taught in any martial arts system I've studied." Collins didn't respond verbally, maintaining his ceremonial bearing, but Bedford answered for him. "Different training for different purposes, Mr. Matthews. Tournament fighting optimizes for rules and points. Military combat optimizes for effectiveness." Eric nodded slowly, a new respect evident in his expression. "I've competed in full contact matches for 15 years and never felt anything like that solar plexus strike. It was..." He searched for the right word. "Perfect." As the police vehicle pulled away, the crowd began to disperse. Tourists approached the guard positions with noticeably different behaviour, maintaining respectful distances, many explaining quietly to their children not just what the guards did, but who they were beneath the ceremonial uniform. Bedford watched with satisfaction before continuing his walk, nodding respectfully to Collins as he passed. The guard stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed forward, the only evidence of the confrontation a small bloodstain at the corner of his mouth, soon to be erased by the afternoon sun. What would you have done in Eric's position? Would you have recognized the difference between ceremonial duty and combat capability? Or would you, like many, have mistaken disciplined stillness for limitation? True strength often manifests not in championship belts or tournament trophies, but in the quiet discipline that knows exactly when to act and when to stand firm in the face of provocation. If this story taught you something new about the Royal Guards, make sure to hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that reveal the truth behind ceremonial traditions. And don't forget to tap the bell icon so you never miss our daily uploads. Check out our previous videos appearing on your screen right now. And we'll see you again tomorrow at the same time with another brand new video that challenges preconceptions and honors those who serve.